On a rainy afternoon in Seattle, a packed local cafe suddenly erupts in rage when a wealthy businessman's expensive watch is splashed with coffee. He violently shoves a table, terrifying an 8-year-old girl and humiliating her father, a quiet man wearing a worn-out jacket. But before anyone can react, 3 heavily armed robbers shatter the glass doors, pointing a loaded shotgun directly at the trembling child. In a split second, the father's eyes turn deadly cold. A retired veteran in the corner gasps, recognizing his lethal combat stance. 10 seconds later, absolutely no one in the cafe can believe their own eyes. The rain in Seattle was relentless, beating a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the fogged-up glass windows of the Blue Mug Cafe. Inside, the atmosphere was a warm, comforting contrast to the dreary world outside, filled with the rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee beans, sweet cinnamon, and the low, comforting murmur of afternoon chatter. In a quiet, dimly lit corner near the back of the room sat Ryan Carter. To any casual observer walking past his table, Ryan was completely invisible, just another tired face in a city of millions. He wore a faded green canvas jacket, visibly patched at the left elbow, and his hands were calloused and rough, bearing the stubborn, dark traces of engine oil embedded deep under his fingernails. Ryan was 41 years old and worked 12-hour shifts as a local air conditioner repairman, living a quiet, simple life where every penny was carefully counted. But if someone with a trained eye had looked closely at him, they would have noticed things that did not fit the profile of an ordinary blue-collar worker. His back was perfectly straight, his shoulders were relaxed but squared, and his eyes never truly rested. Every single time the cafe's front door opened, letting in a gust of cold, wet wind, Ryan's gaze would flick toward the entrance for a fraction of a second, analyzing the newcomer with absolute precision before returning to the small girl sitting directly across from him. This was Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, and the absolute center of Ryan's universe. Sophie possessed bright, incredibly intelligent green eyes and a warm, radiant smile that could melt the coldest winter frost. In her small hands, she held a worn-out drawing notebook with frayed edges held together by layers of clear tape. 2 years ago, a devastating car accident had stolen Ryan's wife, Sarah, from them in an instant. In a single, horrifying night, Ryan's world had shattered into a million jagged pieces, and a suffocating grief had threatened to swallow him whole. But every time he looked at Sophie, he saw his late wife's eyes looking back at him, reminding him that he had to be strong. For her sake, Ryan made the ultimate choice to walk away from his past life. A life hidden in the shadows, filled with highly classified military missions, violence, and blood. He buried his old identity deep in the earth where no one could ever find it, choosing instead to become an ordinary man, a gentle father who repaired appliances. Today was Sophie's 8th birthday, but Ryan's bank account was nearly empty after a series of unexpected, expensive truck repairs had drained his meager savings. He could not afford a grand party, nor could he buy her the expensive video game console she had quietly admired on television. All he could manage for the special day was a quick trip to this local cafe, a single small chocolate cupcake decorated with a colorful, flickering candle, and 2 cups of hot chocolate. Ryan felt a familiar, heavy ache of guilt tightening in his chest as he looked at his daughter, his voice dropping to a soft, apologetic murmur. He apologized, telling her that he had truly wanted to take her to the fancy Italian restaurant downtown with the velvet chairs. But Sophie immediately stopped drawing, reaching across the wooden table to place her tiny, warm hand over his rough, scarred knuckles. With absolute sincerity, she told him that she did not care about fancy restaurants because she loved this cafe, loved the sweet hot chocolate, and loved being with him more than anything else. Ryan smiled warmly, a thick lump forming in his throat as he squeezed her hand, telling her that she was simply too good for this world. Sophie proudly turned her notebook around to show him her latest drawing, which depicted 3 stick figures holding hands. A tall man in a green jacket, a little girl with a backpack, and a beautiful woman with glowing wings floating on a cloud in the sky. Sophie whispered that she knew her mother was watching over them because she had promised her in a dream that her father was the strongest man in the world. Ryan looked away for a brief moment, swallowing his tears and clearing his throat before pointing at the cupcake, encouraging his birthday girl to make a wish. Sophie closed her eyes tight, her long eyelashes fluttering as she took a deep breath and blew out the tiny flame. As the thin trail of gray smoke drifted upward into the warm cafe air, there was a fleeting moment of pure, beautiful peace between a father and his daughter. But Ryan knew from a lifetime of harsh experience that peace was a fragile thing. And in a world like this, it could be shattered in a single, unexpected second. The fragile peace of the afternoon was abruptly shattered by the sharp, arrogant click of expensive leather shoes echoing across the hardwood floor. Enter Charles Whitman, a wealthy 55-year-old corporate executive who wore a bespoke, three-piece charcoal suit that practically screamed old money and influence. His silver hair was perfectly slicked back without a single strand out of place, and on his left wrist, he proudly wore a gleaming, limited-edition platinum Patek Philippe watch. Charles was the kind of man who measured the absolute value of human lives by the number of commas in their bank accounts, and to him, the ordinary people sitting in this cafe were nothing more than background noise. He was speaking incredibly loudly on a Bluetooth earpiece, his voice dripping with condescension as he ordered someone to sell shares immediately and fire anyone who dared to complain about the regulations. Charles paced back and forth near the order counter, completely ignoring the personal space of those around him. At that exact moment, Sophie was laughing warmly at a silly joke Ryan had just made. As she reached out for her warm cup of hot chocolate, her small, excited fingers accidentally slipped on the smooth ceramic surface. The cup tipped slightly, and a small splash of the dark brown liquid flew through the air, landing directly onto the pristine white sleeve of Charles's shirt and onto the face of his platinum watch. Charles stopped dead in his tracks, staring down at his stained sleeve in utter disbelief before his face turned a deep, furious shade of crimson. He roared in anger, causing the entire cafe to fall into a dead, terrified silence as the soft jazz music playing from the speakers suddenly felt incredibly loud. Charles spun around aggressively, his cold eyes locking onto Sophie as he stepped toward their table, screaming at her for being a clumsy, undisciplined brat. Sophie shrank back into her booth, her eyes wide with sudden terror as she dropped her crayons. Ryan immediately stepped in, his voice remaining calm, level, and incredibly polite as he stood up. He apologized sincerely, explaining that it was an accident and reminding the angry man that she was only 8 years old. Ryan pulled a clean paper napkin from the dispenser, offering to help clean the stain and promising to gladly cover the full cost of dry cleaning for the suit. Charles violently swatted Ryan's hand away with absolute disgust, laughing a harsh, mocking laugh as he asked Ryan if he had any real idea who he was talking to or how much the suit actually cost. He pointed aggressively at his wrist, boasting that the Patek Philippe watch was worth $60,000 and claiming that Ryan's entire annual salary could not even purchase the leather strap. Ryan kept his hands open and palms down in a universal gesture of peace, but inside his mind, his dormant military instincts were already analyzing the threat with lethal speed. He calculated the distance of 3 feet, noted Charles's terrible balance, and identified multiple open, vulnerable targets like the exposed throat and knee. Yet, Ryan actively suppressed the urge to fight because he was a father now, not the cold-blooded operative he used to be. He told Charles that he understood his anger but firmly requested that he not raise his voice at his young daughter, repeating his offer to make things right. Charles sneered cruelly, looking at Ryan's patched jacket and calloused hands, asking him mockingly if he planned to pay him back with food stamps. Several people in the cafe gasped at the sheer cruelty of the remark, while others looked away in embarrassment, whispering to one another with a mixture of pity and disdain for the poor father. Charles continued his public humiliation, gesturing wildly to the crowd and claiming that people like Ryan were the reason the city was declining, calling him an absolute failure of a father who did not belong in decent establishments. To emphasize his point, Charles reached out and slammed his hand violently onto their wooden table. The sudden impact shook the table, causing the remaining hot chocolate to spill completely across Sophie's drawing notebook, instantly ruining the beautiful sketch of her mother under a dark, wet stain. Sophie burst into heavy tears, burying her face into Ryan's side while sobbing that she was sorry. Ryan's heart broke into pieces, and in that exact moment, the warmth in his soul froze into solid ice. He looked down at the ruined drawing of his late wife, then at his weeping daughter, and slowly turned his gaze up to Charles Whitman. The eyes that had been filled with gentle, fatherly love just moments ago were completely gone, replaced by a cold, dead, predatory stare that belonged to a man who had looked into the deepest abyss of war and survived. Charles felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver run down his spine, stepping back instinctively as his voice stammered, demanding to know what Ryan was looking at. Ryan did not say a word. He simply knelt down, completely ignoring the billionaire, and gently wiped a tear from Sophie's wet cheek. He whispered to her that they were not poor, promising her that real wealth was the love they shared and that they were actually the richest people in the room. Charles let out another loud, mocking laugh, but before he could utter another insulting word, the heavy glass doors of the cafe were violently blasted inward, and the cold Seattle rain poured into a room that was about to become a war zone. The deafening blast of shattering glass was immediately followed by a harsh, terrifying scream ordering everyone to get on the ground. 3 men exploded into the warm cafe, wearing black tactical masks, heavy dark jackets, and muddy combat boots. The leader of the group carried a menacing, sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun, while the other 2 held black semi-automatic handguns, pointing them wildly at the terrified patrons. Screams of absolute terror echoed through the room as people threw themselves onto the cold, hard floor, desperate to find cover. The robbers barked orders for everyone to put their phones on the tables and hand over their wallets, threatening to paint the walls with the brains of anyone who dared to move. The second robber began moving aggressively from table to table, tearing phones and wallets from trembling hands and shoving them into a heavy canvas duffel bag. Charles Whitman, the arrogant billionaire who had been screaming at an 8-year-old girl just moments before, instantly collapsed to his knees, his expensive suit dragging in the spilled coffee as he shook like a leaf in a hurricane. He frantically tried to slide his $60,000 platinum watch under his thigh to hide it, but the third robber caught the movement and marched over, kicking Charles brutally in the ribs. Charles let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeal, rolling onto his side while clutching his chest and weeping, begging them not to kill him and offering his watch, his cash, and his credit cards in exchange for his life. The robber snatched the expensive watch, laughing loudly at how easily the wealthy coward had broken under pressure. Meanwhile, Ryan had immediately pulled Sophie under their booth, wrapping his muscular frame around her small body to act as a solid, protective human shield. He whispered softly into her ear, telling her to close her eyes, count to 10, and remember that her daddy was right there with her. But the overwhelming noise, the smell of gunpowder, and the sheer violence of the situation were too much for the little girl, and she let out a sharp, terrified sob that cut through the silence. The leader of the robbers, highly agitated and sweating beneath his heavy mask, spun around angrily, demanding to know who was making noise as he marched toward the back of the cafe. His heavy boots came to a halt directly in front of Ryan's table, and he aimed the shotgun straight at Ryan's head, screaming at them to get up. Ryan slowly stood up, keeping his body positioned perfectly to block the robber's view of Sophie, and calmly told the gunman that she was just a child, urging them to take whatever they wanted. The leader, annoyed by Ryan's calm demeanor, claimed the kid's crying was giving him a headache and suggested he should put her to sleep permanently, raising the shotgun directly toward Sophie's face. In that single, frozen millisecond, the air in the cafe grew freezing cold, and the tired, overworked repairman completely vanished. In his place stood a legendary ghost from the nation's most classified military units, a Tier 1 counter-terrorism operator who had spent 15 years surviving the most dangerous combat zones on the planet. In the corner of the cafe, a retired Marine veteran named Marcus was hiding behind the wooden counter, watching the scene play out with a racing heart. But when Marcus saw Ryan's body language shift, his breath caught in his throat. He recognized the subtle, perfect transition of Ryan's feet into a low center of gravity combat stance, and the way his hands rose naturally to chest level, fingers slightly curled and ready to strike with lethal speed. Marcus whispered to himself in absolute shock, realizing that the quiet father was not just military, but elite special forces. The leader of the robbers, completely unaware of the deadly predator standing before him, stepped closer and thrust the barrel of his shotgun against Ryan's chest, asking him if he had a problem. Ryan looked him dead in the eyes, his voice transforming into a cold, metallic rasp as he told the man that his only problem was that they had touched his daughter's table. Before the words could fully register in the robber's mind, Ryan struck with a speed that was almost impossible for the human eye to follow. With his left hand, Ryan slapped the barrel of the shotgun inward, redirecting the line of fire away from himself and Sophie, while his right hand drove forward like a lightning-fast piston, delivering a devastating palm strike directly to the robber's throat. The leader's eyes instantly rolled back as his windpipe collapsed, and as he stumbled, Ryan seized the shotgun, twisting it with such violent force that the robber's wrist dislocated with a sickening pop. Ryan ripped the weapon away, stepped inside the man's guard, and delivered a brutal knee strike to his jaw, knocking him unconscious before he even hit the floor. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, leaving the other 2 robbers frozen in absolute paralyzed shock. The second robber tried to raise his handgun, but Ryan was already moving, racking the slide of the captured shotgun and firing a non-lethal blast directly into the floor at the man's feet. The explosive force blew the robber's legs out from under him, sending sharp wooden splinters into his thighs and leaving him screaming in agony on the floor. Ryan dropped the empty shotgun, smoothly drew the first robber's concealed pistol from his waistband, and pointed it directly at the third criminal. But the third robber, young and completely panicked, made a desperate, cowardly move. He grabbed Sophie, pulling her small body in front of him as a human shield, wrapping his arm tightly around her neck and pressing a handgun against her temple. He screamed hysterically at Ryan to drop the gun, threatening to shoot if he didn't comply. Sophie cried out for her father, and for a split second, Ryan's heart hammered against his ribs in pure agony. He knew he could make the shot. His tactical training gave him a 99% probability of a clean headshot. But in the chaotic reality of close-quarters combat, a dying man's muscle spasm could still pull a trigger, and even a 1% risk to his daughter's life was a risk Ryan refused to take. Slowly, Ryan lowered the pistol, his voice trembling slightly as he urged the gunman to remain calm and take him as a hostage instead, willing to kneel in the dirt to keep his child safe. The young robber, feeling a sudden surge of false confidence, began to back away toward the shattered entrance, dragging Sophie with him. But in her panic, Sophie's grip slipped, and her ruined drawing notebook fell to the wet floor, its pages fluttering in the wind. The robber instinctively glanced down at the notebook for a fraction of a second, and that tiny millisecond of distraction was all the opening Ryan needed. He lunged forward like a striking cobra, grabbing the robber's gun hand and twisting it violently toward the ceiling as a single shot fired harmlessly into the plaster above. With his other arm, Ryan pulled Sophie completely free, throwing her safely behind him, and swept the robber's legs out with a powerful low kick. As the man fell backward, Ryan followed him down with a precise, disabling strike to the temple, knocking him instantly into darkness. Silence descended upon the ruined cafe once more, save for the sound of the falling rain, and Ryan immediately turned around, scooping Sophie up into his arms and holding her so tightly that her ribs ached. He whispered that she was safe, and as Sophie cried into his shoulder, Charles Whitman sat in the dirt, staring in absolute, humbled silence at the man he had called trash. Within minutes of the final blow, the quiet street outside the cafe was filled with a loud, overlapping symphony of sirens as red and blue emergency lights flashed vividly against the wet pavement. Police officers and paramedics swarmed into the shattered building, carrying the 3 unconscious robbers out in heavy steel handcuffs, 2 of them loaded onto stretchers. Local news reporters arrived almost immediately, their cameras flashing in the dark as they hungrily searched for the hero of the hour. A young, ambitious reporter tried to push a microphone directly into Ryan's face, asking him if he was former Special Forces and demanding to know his name. But Ryan simply pulled his faded jacket over Sophie's face to shield her from the bright, intrusive lights, keeping his head down as he quietly told them he had no comment. He insisted that he was just a regular father who did what any loving parent would do, walking past the crowded cameras and disappearing into the cold Seattle rain because he did not want the world looking too closely at the life he had left behind. Charles Whitman sat in the back of an open ambulance, a thick orange shock blanket wrapped around his expensive, ruined suit. His face was pale, and his $60,000 platinum watch sat forgotten on a small metal table beside him. He stared at the watch, then turned his gaze to the street, watching the quiet father carry his daughter away into the dark. For the first time in over 30 years, Charles felt a deep, suffocating sense of shame wash over him. The millions of dollars in his investment portfolios could not stop his hands from shaking, and his status could not restore the dignity he had thrown away. He had acted like a monster to a family that possessed nothing but love, and the very man he had spit upon had risked his life to save him without a single moment of hesitation. 3 days later, the scent of motor oil and rust filled the air of Ryan's small, dusty repair shop as he worked quietly under the hood of an old sedan. A shadow fell across his grease-stained workspace, and Ryan slid out from beneath the vehicle to find Charles Whitman standing there. He wasn't wearing his expensive designer suit. Instead, he wore a simple knit sweater and a pair of worn-out jeans, looking much smaller, older, and incredibly humbled. Charles asked quietly if Ryan had a moment to speak, and Ryan, wiping his black hands on an old shop rag, calmly told him that if he was there to offer him money, he could save his time. Charles shook his head slowly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a check written for $50,000. He admitted that he had initially planned to offer the money, but realized that doing so would just be another attempt to buy his way out of his terrible behavior, and respect was something money could never purchase. He looked down at his shoes, his voice cracking with emotion as he offered a sincere, deeply felt apology to Ryan and his daughter. Ryan stared at him, measuring the truth in his eyes, and asked him why he had reacted with such immense, venomous anger over a simple splash of coffee. Charles let out a long, ragged sigh, sitting down on an old tire as he confessed that 10 years ago, his beloved wife had died of cancer, leaving his world completely cold and empty. He explained that he had decided the only way to protect himself from ever being hurt again was to build an impenetrable wall of money and power, becoming bitter and cruel to anyone who seemed happy. He admitted that when he saw Ryan and Sophie, he was filled with a deep, ugly jealousy because he saw a father who truly loved his child, something he had lost and could never buy back. Ryan listened to the confession in silence, the anger in his chest completely evaporating, replaced by a deep, human understanding. He walked over, placed a calloused hand gently on Charles's shoulder, and told him that while loss can do terrible things to a man, he must never let the pain make him forget how to be human, urging him to never let the darkness make him forget how to love. Those words hit Charles like a physical blow, and he buried his face in his hands, weeping tears of true relief. 6 months flew by, and the long, freezing Seattle winter slowly gave way to the gentle warmth of a beautiful spring. The endless rain finally stopped, and the bright sun began to peek through the heavy clouds, bringing new life to a city that had been dark for so long. During those 6 months, lives were quietly but profoundly transformed. Charles Whitman did not return to his cutthroat corporate lifestyle. Instead, he resigned from his high-pressure executive position, sold his massive luxury penthouse, and moved into a modest, peaceful home. Using a massive portion of his personal fortune, he established the Sarah and Sophie Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing financial aid to single parents and offering free mental health counseling to combat veterans adjusting to civilian life. Charles had finally found a true purpose for his wealth, using it not as a cold shield to keep people away, but as a warm bridge to bring them together. Ryan Carter's daily life remained largely the same. He still worked long, exhausting hours repairing air conditioners, and still wore his faded green canvas jacket. But his shoulders felt lighter, and the heavy ghost of his violent past had finally been laid to rest in the soil of his new life. It was Sophie's 9th birthday, and they returned together to the newly renovated Blue Mug Café, where the shattered entrance had been replaced by a beautiful, expansive bay window that let in the golden afternoon light. They sat at the exact same wooden table in the back corner, but this time, they were joined by Charles Whitman, who wore a warm, peaceful smile. Charles reached into his bag and presented Sophie with a large gift wrapped in bright blue paper, which she tore open to find a professional, top-tier wooden art kit filled with vibrant pencils, high-quality watercolors, and thick sketch pads. Sophie gasped in delight, thanking him warmly, and Charles smiled, telling her he expected to see some true masterpieces. Sophie smiled brightly and reached into her backpack, pulling out her old water-damaged drawing notebook from 6 months ago. She turned to a fresh page at the back and carefully tore out a beautiful drawing she had created just for him. Charles took the paper, his eyes scanning a detailed sketch of the cafe showing Sophie, Ryan, and Charles all holding hands with wide, happy smiles, under a caption written in her neat, childish handwriting stating that the strongest people are the ones who protect others. A warm tear escaped Charles's eye, sliding down his cheek and landing on his wrist, but this time, he did not care about a wet sleeve. He folded the drawing with immense care, sliding it into his breast pocket right next to his heart, whispering that it was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. An hour later, Ryan and Sophie walked out of the cafe into a breathtaking Seattle sunset that painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold, pink, and purple. Sophie clutched her new art kit tightly, squeezing her father's fingers with her other hand as she looked up at him, asking him if he was a superhero. Ryan stopped walking, looking down at his beautiful daughter as the cool evening breeze rustled his hair. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around her, and whispered with a peaceful smile that he was not a superhero. When she asked him what he was, Ryan pulled her close, telling her that he was simply her father, and that was the greatest job in the entire world. Have you ever judged someone's entire worth based solely on the clothes they wore or the job they had to do to survive? Have you ever met an ordinary person who possessed an extraordinary hidden strength when the world needed it most? If you had been sitting in that cafe on that rainy afternoon, would you have focused on the $60,000 watch? Or would you have remembered the quiet father who stood up to protect everyone? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Never judge a book by its cover, because the quietest, most humble person in the room might just be the one holding the courage to save your life. Real heroes do not wear capes, and they do not search for the spotlight. Sometimes, they are simply parents working quietly in the background, willing to do absolutely anything to protect the ones they love.